John Scanlon. John Scanlon is a dear friend, and in global terms, he's a neighbour because he's just across the lake here in Switzerland. So, hi, John. It's great to see you, sir.
Great to see you, Paul. Thanks for the invitation.
Great. And John Scanlon, for those who don't know, is the current chief exec of the Elephant Protection Initiative Foundation, which do amazing work, really great frontline work. I know John from the work at CITES and Africa Parks. And in fact, John has been very helpful in both those departments, particularly African Parks, with some of the work I do at sea. It's been absolutely brilliant. And John, welcome, sir. Thanks very much for joining us. And this is going to be what we hope might feel like a well-rehearsed, although we haven't done it, bit of a twin effort here, because I'm going to try and ask key questions, and John will then give us answers, give us opinions, give us guidance, and also run some images at the same time. So here we go with that first image, John. For me, John, it's all about COVID at the moment. Everything I do seems to be framed in a COVID perspective, obviously. And we say, that we're here because of this out of balance relationship with nature. But how did it happen? What's the story with the pandemic? And what about the risk for future pandemics?
Great. Thanks, Paul. Thanks again. And congratulations on everything you've achieved, both last year and this year. Yeah, I mean, this COVID-19 pandemic has been devastating, and over the past 12 months or so, it's been omnipresent. And we've seen governments struggling to stop it from spreading. They've been striving to vaccinate us. I'm very fortunate. I'm in a country where I was able to get my first shot of Moderna a couple of weeks back. I'll get my second shot next week. And also countries are wanting to understand the origins of COVID-19 so that we can prevent this into the future. Now, there's been a lot of speculation over the past, 12 months or so about what the origins of COVID-19 were. But quite recently, we got a WHO report. And what's clear is that the most likely scenario is that this virus spilled over from animal to human, possibly a bat, or from animal, possibly a bat, to another animal, possibly a pangolin, through to humans. The authors of that report, one author thought maybe it was from bats to animals at a wildlife farm that was supplying an animal market. But at the end of the day, the most likely scenario from animal to human. Now, even leaving COVID-19 aside for one moment, we do know that viruses have spilt over from wild animals to humans previously. SARS, MERS, HIV/AIDS, there are many examples of that. And scientists have been warning us for decades about this risk, about the sorts of conditions that can lead to a spillover of a virus through to humans. And now, since this pandemic, we're seeing even more science. The UN IPBES has put out a report, and it tells us that it estimates there are 1.7 million undiscovered viruses in wild animals, mammalian and avian hosts in particular, and that about half of them could spill over to people. Then we're also told that about 60% of emerging infectious diseases are zoonotic, so from non-human animals to humans, and that 70% of them come from wild animals. So the most likely source is from animal, possibly a bat, to people. We know the origins of previous pandemics in wild animals, and we've got all this science about the risk of future pandemics. So we're really put on notice here. Not only are we experiencing this devastating pandemic, but we've been put on notice that this is not the end. There are a whole lot of risk ahead of us, and we have to do something to mitigate those risks.
Yeah, it's fantastic, John, because when we talk about COVID and we talk about the fact that we're here because of this out of balance relationship with nature, I get excited when I think that science data has never been so well respected and recognized as being the way out of this. We, as you well said, we've got vaccines. I've had my number one Moderna too. I'm a little bit behind you in a week or so. But the reality is that the only guarantee against future pandemics is to reset that balance with nature. So the way you put it is absolutely perfect. But do you think countries are doing enough now? Are countries doing anything now to stop future wildlife-related pandemics?
So we have seen some action underway, Paul. We've seen certain countries, China, Gabon, Italy, Vietnam, have taken some measures with respect to wildlife trade, wildlife markets, wildlife consumption in different ways. We are seeing a number of initiatives within the intergovernmental community in terms of the science, in terms of looking at ways and means of preventing these. But the reality is it's not good enough for 1, 2, 5 or 10 countries to do something or to take measures to try and prevent this spillover in the first place, because viruses can spill over from wild animals to people anywhere. And so what this is going to take is all countries to take a collective and coordinated approach to this if we are going to prevent future wildlife related pandemics. So it's good that some countries are moving, that's to be commended, but we actually need all countries to move, because this is a risk that we're confronting, and a new virus could emerge from anywhere on the planet. So really this is one issue that demands a global collective effort.
Absolutely. Thanks, John. It feels a bit like it's that call, isn't it, once again, for a collective global, environmental leadership. And you're very much part of that. But there's a really basic question I have, John, is that from a human perspective, it's easy to look at, it's the wildlife that's the problem. If they didn't come over here into our bit of the environment, we wouldn't have the problem. But it's us that's the problem, or is it both? What's the real problem?
Yeah, no, look, it's a great point, Paul, and it's one that we have to continually emphasize, and that is that wild animals left alone don't pose a health risk to us. The problem is not with the wild animals, the problem is with us and the way in which we interact with wildlife. Now, that includes the way in which we're intruding into wild places to clear these places and therefore coming into contact with wild animals. It's got to do with the way in which we are capturing wild animals, holding them, transporting them, consuming them, marketing. So this is all about us. And we have to remember that. It's about us as human beings and the way in which we interrelate with wild animals. That is what is exposing us to risk. That is why we need to, as you were saying earlier, recalibrate our relationship with nature. We have to address some of the bad practices, the way in which we are clearing and intruding into wild places, the way in which we are trading in wildlife, addressing wildlife crime, addressing wildlife markets and consumption. So it's about us. So that's in our control. We can address that.
And John, what's your perspective? Can you give us a bit of guidance on the fact that we all know these things are connected? I mean, it wasn't many years ago people only looked at climate change, or they only looked at overfishing, or they looked at, you name it. But now everybody understands it's climate change, it's the loss of habitat, it's this whole pressure that we put on the system. So it feels that we have to tackle them all together. But how do we communicate that to everybody watching, and hopefully the global leaders that are watching and big influencers that are watching into action? How can we take all of them together without making it seem such a massive task that we're rooted to the spot and can't do anything?
Yeah, look, it's really important, Paul. And as you said, we're confronting, multiple crises, and just think of 3 interrelated crises. We have the biodiversity crisis, where we're told by UN IPBES that we could lose up to 1 million species over the coming decades if we don't change course. We've got climate change, and we're not on course to meet what we set out for ourselves in the Paris Agreement and all the implications of that. And we're living through this pandemic, this massive crisis. And as we were just discussing, we know that this is not the end, because there are so many other viruses that could spill over to human beings if we don't change the way in which we're acting. And as you said, Paul, we have this habit as humans. It's because it's easier if we can take things in little bite-sized pieces. So we look at biodiversity, we look at climate, or we look at a pandemic, and we disaggregate them so that we can get a handle on them. That doesn't work anymore, and in particular where you've got interrelated crises, as we have here. Biodiversity and the loss of biodiversity and the loss of ecosystem services, like the ability to mitigate climate change, to sequester carbon, has a big impact on climate change. And then loss of biodiversity and the impacts of climate change, that all has an impact on potential future zoonoses, zoonotic diseases spilling over from wild animals to people. So we have to look at them in an interrelated way. And we have all the science. Now, what what I feel is that we've known this for a long time, that we have to look at these things together, even though our instinct is always to pull them apart. We're now recognizing we have to actually bring them back together. There was a sort of an effort to do that with climate change, and people sort of got it, the nexus between climate change and biodiversity loss, etc. But I do think that the penny has really dropped with this COVID-19 pandemic. I get a sense, and I'm sure you do too, Paul, is that this has perhaps been a moment where people, corporations, governments have recognized that we've got things out of balance. You know, we have to rethink the way in which we are dealing with wildlife, wild places, the way in which we're dealing with biodiversity more generally, how we're addressing climate change, because they are all interrelated. And the beauty is we can package it together in a way where we can address biodiversity loss, climate change, and the risk of future pandemics. We can deal with that in a coherent way. The reality is we have to, if we want to live on a planet that's prosperous and healthy.
Brilliant, John. Yes, I do agree. I think we've accidentally got ourselves in a bit of a sweet spot for biodiversity, because the awareness levels have never been so high. And people genuinely realize that our health is reliant on everybody else's health, which in turn is reliant on the health of the planet. And we never would have seen that in the newspapers a few years ago, but now we do, you know. So we really have underscored the point and proved the point in many ways that we're lazy as a species, aren't we, humans? We only change when we absolutely have to. And now the situation is bad enough, guess what? We're going to change. I mean, and part of that change is your new initiative, the Global Initiative to End Wildlife Crime. You're the chair of that. And I'm sure it's going to be a big success, John, but can you tell us about it, please?
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, we launched the Global Initiative to End Wildlife Crime on the 5th of June last year. And we all know the 5th of June, it's World Environment Day. It's hosted by the ADM Capital Foundation in Hong Kong, SAR. And basically, it's a gathering of people and organizations that have many different views on many different topics, but we all converge on the fact that our international legal framework is no longer fit for purpose. That the framework we put in place 50 years ago and a little more recently is not going to enable us to prevent future wildlife-related pandemics, nor is it going to enable us to stop wildlife crime and all of the devastating consequences associated with it. So we came together. There's a small steering group. We now have 25 champion organizations, from the World Travel and Tourism Council, Jane Goodall Global, through to ADM Capital. So it's a mix of industry associations, private sector, non-government foundations, etc. We've all come together, and what we've said is that we believe that there are two gaps in the international legal framework that we do need to fill. And these gaps relate to wildlife trade and how we regulate wildlife trade and markets. We say there's a gap there because the current system we have looks at wildlife trade from a biodiversity conservation perspective, not from a human or animal health perspective. So we say what we need to do there is take a One Health approach to wildlife trade. We've proposed how we can do that. Then the other gap we say is in how we deal with wildlife crime. Wildlife trafficking is a massive, illicit, organized transnational crime. And if you look at all species that are in trade, in illegal trade and being trafficked illicitly, the World Bank says it's probably valued that the contraband itself is valued at 200 billion a year. Governments are losing up to 12 billion of revenue a year. But what the World Bank did, which is really important, is they said, but let's look at the impacts of this illicit trafficking of wild animals and plants, be it timber, fish, or the other wildlife. They said if you put a value on the impact on ecosystem services, they value it at $1 to $2 trillion a year. That this illicit trafficking in wildlife is having an impact of somewhere between $1 and $2 trillion a year. It's stopping us from saving biodiversity, from combating climate change, and it exposes us to future pandemics, because when wild animals are in illegal trade, they don't go through any checks. They just go straight from source to destination, and nobody's looking to see whether it carries any risk. So what we're saying is that we need to do more about that. And at the moment, there is no global agreement on tackling wildlife crime. There are agreements on human trafficking, migrant smuggling, firearms smuggling, trafficking. What we say is we need to actually have a global agreement here on preventing and combating wildlife trafficking. So they're the two gaps. We say we've got one gap in how we regulate wildlife trade. We have to take a One Health approach there. We've got a gap in how we deal with wildlife crime. Both expose us to future pandemics, but there are many other consequences. In particular, if we look at wildlife crime in terms of biodiversity, in terms of climate change, in terms of security, in terms of government revenue and livelihoods. So that's what we were created to promote. We're actively promoting that now through our steering group and our 25 champions. But they're our two fundamental pillars. We want to see an international framework that's fit for purpose in 2021.
Well, fantastic. I think a lot of people watching us and joining us today would be as surprised as I am constantly that there isn't a big legal framework to make this happening. And it's just crazy because we hear about CITES, we hear about all these other things, and we were joined a few hours ago by the great James Thornton, my friend from Client Earth, now leading the charge on establishing enforceable international environmental laws. And it's a big job, John. Do you work with Client Earth in your great suite of lawyers and legal pushes to get these laws changed?
So we're working with anyone that wants to work with us, but we have a very wide array of organisations that are working with us. And on the legal side, for example, Legal Atlas, Wildlife Justice Commission, and many others. So look, there's a good international community there that is looking at the issue of our international legal framework. It's no longer fit for purpose. We need to change it, and we need to be active in drawing that to the attention of citizens and politicians.
Brilliant. It's an irresistible project that you're onto here, John, an absolutely vital global initiative. How much support have you got so far?
Yeah, so there's two issues that we're pushing. The first one is the issue of a One Health approach to wildlife trade. And with that, we're saying there are many different ways to achieve that. We think the most effective and efficient way to do that is to amend CITES, the Wildlife Trade Convention, because at the moment it only looks at the impact of a trade on the survival of that species from the place it's taken. We say you have to look at the impact of that trade, not only on the survival of that species from where it's taken, but what impact it could have when it's in transit and when it gets to its destination. What could be the impact on human and animal health? So we're saying amend CITES, or you, for example, could look at a new agreement under the WHO as is being proposed. We need to change the law there. The other bit we're saying is you have to look at the issue of wildlife crime. We need a new wildlife crime agreement that can be done as a fourth protocol under the UN Convention Against Transnational Organised Crime. Now, we've been working with many different individuals, but at the end of the day, this is about what governments want to do. Governments create the international legal framework, or states, they create the international legal framework that we operate under. So they need to be persuaded. It's states that need to decide that they want to change the international legal framework that they've created for themselves. So we've been very active reaching out to countries and putting these facts, as we're discussing today, to them. Now, we're delighted that on Monday of this week, the presidents of Gabon and Costa Rica, President Ali Bongo Ondimba and President Carlos Alvarado Quesada, they put out a joint statement. And what they have said together in this statement, and it was conveyed to the current session of the Commission on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice, which is sitting this week, and they've said that they believe that we need a fourth protocol to the UN Convention Against Transnational Organised Crime on combating and preventing illicit trafficking in wildlife. And they've said we need to do this to save biodiversity, combat climate change, to prevent future pandemics, but to also be sure that it's local people, legitimate investors, and the national budgets of source countries that are benefiting from their wildlife, their fish, their timber, and their other wildlife, and not transnational organised criminals. And they say to do that, we're going to need a protocol to treat this as the serious crime that it is. And I think, Paul, you've got a very short video there that sets out the message that came from the two presidents and the reasons why they made such a strong statement this week.
Yes, please. Thanks, John. Let's run the video. Thank you. Wow, John, that video needs to be on every single social media channel and mainstream channel going all the time. And it's that last line. There is no global agreement on legal wildlife trade. Wow. John, you and I could talk on this forever, but we've got some exciting questions here. Have you got a moment to take them?
Of course, Paul. Yep.
There's a great question here. How can we encourage countries to place funding into conservation and preventative efforts if they're struggling from the economic impacts of the pandemic and are wanting to place funds instead into socio-economic issues, e.g. healthcare and housing, which some might argue are currently more important? How does this work today financially?
Yeah, I think what we need to look at, we've tended to look at wildlife purely from a wildlife lens. We look at it as wild animals and wild plants. We've got to step back a little bit and say, what are the benefits of investing in wildlife and wild places? Now, the benefits of doing that are multiple. It's protecting biodiversity and the ecosystem services, producing fresh water, fresh soil, producing fresh air. They're the climate benefits in terms of mitigating climate change. They're the benefits of preventing future pandemics, but there are also huge benefits in terms of generating local jobs, providing local and regional security. So if we look at it from that lens, we need to see investment in wild places come from health agencies, development agencies, security-based agencies, because they are the benefits. Too long we draw on wildlife budgets, but the benefits of this investment cut across security, health, and development. So if we can recognize those benefits, we should secure funding from other sources. And in particular, in some remote communities that I've visited as well, these investments in wild places generate fantastic local jobs, local opportunities, local enterprise, and also provide security in these places. So let's take a broader perspective here. And we also need to see development agencies invest in wildlife because there are huge development benefits.
I love you, John, because you're just like me, you know, in the face of these big odds, we're both still optimistic, aren't we? I'm not making a jump here. You are optimistic, I think.
No, I have to be quite frank, I don't see much point in being pessimistic. I mean, I do believe we have to be realistic. I mean, we're up against it, so we'll be realistic. You know, we're up against all these challenges, but hey, we have to be optimistic. And, you know, humans have great capacity to be destructive, but we also have great capacity to be constructive. And I really do think we're at a point in history where we can turn things around. If you look at the youth of the world and what they're saying, you look at the awakening you see across governments and the corporate sector and others that, you know, we've got this thing out of balance. I do think that we have an opportunity to shift things around, but we need everybody, everybody on this call, everyone we interact with. You know, we need everybody on board to push this, because if we get enough momentum, we can swing it around for sure.
John, fantastic. Well, there you go, everybody. A call to action from the man who knows, John Scanlon. Please do follow his work online. And John, you know, thanks so much for taking valuable time out to join us. I mean, this is an inspirational session covering such a big range of stuff, but it doesn't actually root us into instability. It drives us into action. So, John, you've done it once again. Thank you so much, sir. Absolutely brilliant. Keep up the great work.
And well, thanks to you, Paul. Great session, and I look forward to the next coming days. So great work.
All right, buddy. Thanks, John. See you soon.
Thanks very much.